It's hard to explain why I remember that night so vividly. It might be because I've never really processed it, or maybe because it's the kind of thing you don't want to believe actually happened. But it did, and the moment I let myself acknowledge that truth, I knew I had to tell someone. Maybe so I don't feel as alone in knowing it anymore. It started during my second year in college. The campus was quiet that evening. Most students had left for winter break. I stayed behind, telling myself I'd catch up on assignments and prep for exams. Truthfully, I just wanted to avoid going home. My dorm floor was practically empty. You could hear a pin drop, except for the occasional thud of someone dragging a suitcase to the elevator. Around 11 p.m., I was in my room, scrolling through Reddit while the sound of a true crime podcast played in the background. The narrator was droning on about some unsolved case when the lights in my room flickered. Just for a second, but long enough for me to notice. I brushed it off as a power surge, but then I heard something. Faint, repetitive tapping sound. Tap tap, tap tap. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. It didn't match the rhythm of the radiator pipes, nor did it sound like something you could blame on wind. I muted the podcast and listened closely. The tapping continued, steady as a heartbeat, coming from above. The weird part? I was on the top floor. It wasn't like the old dorms at some colleges. There was no attic space or anything above my room but the roof. I reasoned it could have been maintenance or maybe some animal skittering around, but I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. I turned the podcast back on, trying to drown out the noise, but it didn't help. The tapping grew louder. Tap tap, tap tap. I decided to investigate. Grabbing my phone for light, I ventured into the hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air felt unnaturally cold, like someone had left a window open. But the hall was empty. That's when I noticed the door to the stairwell was ajar. A soft, cold draft spilled through the gap. Now, I should have just gone back to my room and locked the door. Any rational person would have. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled me toward the stairs. I pushed the door open, and it groaned like a warning. The stairwell was dimly lit, shadows pooling in every corner. That's when I saw it. About 3 steps up, a single wet footprint glistened on the concrete. Barefoot, too large to belong to any of the girls on my floor, and definitely too fresh to have been there long. My stomach tightened, but I couldn't make myself turn around. Instead, I followed the footprints, one after the other, leading up and up. The pattern was strange. Left, right, left, and then they'd skip a step as if the person had been leaping. At the top of the stairs was the access door to the roof. A rusted metal sign bolted to the door read "Authorized personnel only." It was open. I poked my head through the gap, shining my phone light across the rooftop. The beam caught glimpses of frost-covered vents and water tanks, but no one was there. At least not that I could see. That's when I heard it again. Tap tap. This time it was louder, closer. The sound was coming from the far edge of the roof, near the guardrail. My pulse quickened, and I froze, torn between running back down the stairs and proving to myself that this wasn't as bizarre as it seemed. So I took a step forward, then another, and that's when I saw him. A man, crouched low on the edge of the roof, silhouetted against the distant glow of the city. He was dressed in what looked like tattered black clothes, and his limbs were bent at odd angles, like he didn't quite understand how human joints were supposed to work. His head snapped toward me, and my breath caught in my throat. His face, it wasn't right. Too smooth, like someone had stretched a mask over his skull. Where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, black hollows. I staggered back, but he moved faster than I thought possible. One moment he was perched on the guardrail, and the next he was standing in front of me. "Leave," he rasped, his voice a low, guttural hiss. My legs didn't need to be told twice. I bolted down the stairs, heart hammering so loud I could barely hear my own thoughts. Behind me, the tapping followed, echoing down the stairwell, faster and louder with each step I took. When I reached my floor, I slammed the stairwell door shut and locked it. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep that night, didn't even leave my room until morning. Maintenance later said they found nothing unusual on the roof. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. The security cameras? Offline due to technical issues. To this day, I don't know who or what that was, but I can still hear the tapping in my nightmares. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it hadn't happened. Sleep deprivation, maybe. Stress. I had been running on caffeine and deadlines, and my imagination could have filled in the gaps. But as I stood in the dorm hallway waiting for the elevator, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A wet footprint. It was faint, almost dry now, but it was there. A single print right where the stairwell door met the hall carpet. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Oh yeah. By the way, there's some guy with no eyes climbing around on the roof. I'd be laughed out of the dorm. Still, the thought wouldn't leave me alone. My classes passed in a blur, and by the time the sun set, the unease had fully settled back in my chest. That night, I avoided my room. I stayed in the common area on the first floor, parked in front of the TV with a few other students who hadn't gone home for the break. We watched movies, ordered pizza, and talked about everything except the weird emptiness of campus. It wasn't until well past midnight that I finally returned to my floor. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual. The flickering lights didn't help. As I stepped out into the hallway, the quiet hit me like a wall. My shoes squeaked on the tile floor, the only sound in the empty corridor. I reached my room, slid the key into the lock, and paused. The air felt wrong, like the silence wasn't empty but waiting. The second I opened the door, I knew. Something had been inside. My chair was pushed out from the desk, slightly angled. My laptop was on, the screen casting a soft glow over the room. And there, right in the middle of my bed, was a single wet footprint. My breath caught, and I stepped back into the hall, slamming the door shut behind me. What was I supposed to do? Call campus security and tell them someone broke into my room to leave a footprint? I knew how ridiculous it sounded, but I couldn't go back in there. Not alone. So I went to find Paul. Paul lived 2 floors down and was one of the few people I'd become friends with since starting college. He was the kind of guy who always had your back. Easygoing, a little too obsessed with conspiracy theories, but reliable. When I knocked on his door, it took him a few minutes to answer. "Dude," he said, rubbing his eyes. "It's like 1 a.m. What's up?" "There's something in my room," I blurted out, not caring how it sounded. Paul's brows furrowed. "Something? I mean someone. I think someone broke in. That got his attention." He grabbed his phone and a flashlight, muttering something about how weird crap always happens when the campus is empty, and followed me back to my floor. The hallway was still dead silent when we got there. I hesitated before unlocking my door. Paul, however, pushed past me, flashlight in hand. "All right," he said, scanning the room. "Let's see this something." He checked the closet, under the bed, even the bathroom. Nothing. But then he stopped. "What's this?" He was standing by my bed, staring at the wet footprint. "I told you," I said, my voice shaky. Paul crouched down, inspecting it. "It's weird. Doesn't look like it was made by a shoe or anything. It's almost too big to be a person's foot." He stood up and frowned at me. "You sure this wasn't already here?" I shook my head. "I've been here all semester. That wasn't there before." Paul opened his mouth to say something, but then his flashlight flickered, and we heard it. Tap tap. We both froze. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Tap tap. It was coming from the hallway. Paul motioned for me to stay put and stepped out. Flashlight aimed down the corridor. "Hello?" he called. Silence. Then, without warning, the sound shifted. It wasn't faint anymore. It was running. Fast. Tap 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 tap. I didn't see it, but Paul did. His face went pale, and he stumbled back into the room, slamming the door shut. "What?" I whispered. "I don't know," he hissed, his breathing ragged. "I don't know what the hell I just saw." His hands were shaking, and he refused to explain. All he said was, "We're not staying here tonight." Neither of us slept. Paul and I ended up crashing in his room, barricading the door with his desk and anything else we could move. He stayed quiet most of the night, eyes darting toward the window like he was expecting something to come through it. I didn't press him for details. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The next morning, the campus felt even emptier. The weight of what had happened the night before pressed down on me, but I couldn't just ignore it. Whatever Paul had seen, it had to be real. It wasn't just me losing my mind. I need to know what's going on. I told him over breakfast in the dining hall. Paul shook his head. We're not dealing with this. I saw enough to know we don't want to mess with it. But we can't just pretend it didn't happen. Paul looked at me like I'd suggested summoning the thing ourselves. Listen, man. Some stuff, you just let it go. Forget it. Whatever that was, it's not our problem. But I couldn't let it go. That evening, after Paul refused to come with me, I decided to investigate on my own. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe I just wanted closure, or maybe I was still in denial, hoping I'd find something that made sense. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I went back to the stairwell. The wet footprints were gone, but the door to the roof was still slightly open, just as it had been before. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as I approached the roof, and I felt the familiar chill of something wrong. When I reached the top, I hesitated. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the wind hit me like a slap, cold and sharp. The roof was empty. I stepped out, scanning the area with my flashlight. The vent covers rattled in the breeze, and the hum of the city below was the only sound. But then I heard it. Tap tap. My flashlight flickered, and I froze. The sound was coming from the edge of the roof, near the same spot I'd seen him the first time. Slowly, I moved the beam of light toward the sound. First, there was nothing, just shadows dancing against the walls. Then I saw it. Not the man, but something else. It looked like a piece of paper, fluttering in the wind. But as I approached, I realized it was pinned to the ground with what looked like a shard of broken glass. My hands shook as I picked it up. The paper was damp and smeared with something dark, almost like ink. There were only 3 words scrawled on it, jagged and uneven like they'd been written in a frenzy. Don't come back. I didn't wait to see what would happen if I ignored the warning. I ran, leaving the roof behind, the door slamming shut behind me. When I got back to Paul's room, I showed him the note. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared at it like it was going to burn a hole in the floor. Finally, he looked at me. We need to leave. Tonight. And we did. We packed what we could carry and drove to a friend's place off campus, vowing not to go back until the dorms were full of people again. I transferred to another school the next semester, and Paul did the same. But even now, years later, I still wonder, what would have happened if I'd ignored the warning? And more importantly, what happens to the people who don't leave? Months passed, but the memories didn't fade. They clung to me like a shadow, always there in the back of my mind. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think I heard the tapping again. Soft at first, then louder, echoing in my dreams. I convinced myself it was just the trauma, an overactive imagination. But then Paul called me. It was the first time I'd heard from him since we left campus. His voice was tight, almost shaking. Have you seen the news? He asked. I hadn't. He told me to check the local college forum, one of those anonymous message boards where students aired complaints or shared gossip. Reluctantly, I pulled it up. At the top of the page, a thread was pinned. Weird happenings in East Tower dorm. My stomach dropped. The post was written by someone still living in the building, and it described eerie sounds in the stairwell, strange marks appearing on the walls, and, most chilling of all, wet footprints leading to the roof. It wasn't just me. I scrolled through the comments, most of them laughing it off as some prank or urban legend. But a few people took it seriously. One person claimed they'd seen someone on the roof late at night, a man with no eyes just standing at the edge watching the city. Another comment caught my attention. My roommate disappeared last week. The cops say he just packed up and left, but his stuff's still here. No way he left on his own. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Paul spoke again, his voice quieter now. It's not just the dorms. There's something bigger going on. What do you mean? I've been looking into it, he said. The footprints, the tapping, the guy you saw, they've been reported before. Years ago. Different colleges, different dorms, but the same story. He sent me a link to a blog, some obscure site that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. The author had documented similar encounters: students vanishing, strange sounds, figures lurking on rooftops. But the scariest part? Every story ended the same way. Leave, or it will come for you. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found myself doing something I swore I'd never do again. Going back. I didn't tell Paul. He would have tried to stop me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The campus felt even emptier than I remembered, the East Tower looming like a shadow against the overcast sky. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the way, my heart pounding in my chest. The stairwell door was locked, but I found a way in through an emergency exit someone had propped open. The air inside was cold, stale, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. The building was quiet, too quiet. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and reached the top floor. The door to the roof was still open. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped out into the cold, bracing myself for whatever I might find. First, there was nothing, just the wind and the distant hum of the city. But then I saw them. Not one, not two, 5 figures, crouched near the edge of the roof, their limbs twisted and unnatural. Their heads snapped toward me in unison, hollow eyes locking onto mine. I froze. One of them, the closest, stood up, its movements jerky, almost mechanical. It stepped toward me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Leave," it rasped, the same guttural voice I'd heard before. The others began to move, their bodies contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "Leave," they all said in unison, their voices blending into a horrible, unnatural harmony. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, the sound of their tapping footsteps chasing me down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, locking the doors and speeding away. I haven't been back since, but I still think about those figures on the roof, their hollow eyes watching me. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear them tapping outside my window. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise in the dark made my skin crawl. Tap on the window, the creak of the floorboards. Even my own heartbeat seemed too loud. I kept my curtains drawn tight, double-checked the locks on my doors, and left every light in my apartment on at night. But none of it mattered. The first sign came 3 nights after my visit to the East Tower. I was sitting on my couch, staring blankly at the TV. Some sitcom was playing, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to those figures on the roof, the way their heads moved in unison, the sound of their voices. That's when I noticed it. A shadow. It flickered across the edge of the window, quick but deliberate, like someone walking by. I froze, my eyes locked on the curtain. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the TV and the sound of my own breathing. And then, tap-tap. The sound was faint, almost polite, like a knuckle lightly rapping against the glass. I didn't move, couldn't. Tap-tap. It was louder this time, more insistent, against every instinct screaming at me to stay put. I stood up and slowly pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. The street below was empty, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows over the pavement. I closed the curtain, my hands shaking. But as I turned away, I saw it. In the faint reflection of the glass, a figure stood behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The tapping didn't stop after that night. It came randomly, sometimes on the windows, sometimes on the walls. Always at night. Always when I was alone. I tried everything. Moving apartments. Staying with friends. Even crashing at a motel for a few nights. But no matter where I went, it found me. I thought about telling Paul, but I knew what he'd say. "You should have left it alone." And he'd be right. Then one night it escalated. I was lying in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, every light in the apartment blazing. The tapping had been relentless that evening, moving from window to window, wall to wall. But then it stopped. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over. I even started to drift off to sleep. And that's when I heard it. The doorknob. It rattled softly, as if someone was testing it. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The knob rattled again, harder this time. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I whispered to the operator, "Someone's trying to get into my apartment." The operator stayed on the line, assuring me help was on the way. But the rattling didn't stop. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. I stared in horror as the figures stepped inside, their bodies twisting and contorting to fit through the frame. Their hollow eyes locked onto me, and their voices rasped in unison. "Leave!" I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. They stepped closer, their movements unnatural, their limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. And then, just as they reached the edge of my bed, they stopped. One of them, taller than the rest, leaned down, its face inches from mine. "You were warned," it hissed, its voice like shattered glass. And then they were gone. The police arrived minutes later, finding nothing but a door that had been forced open and a shaking wreck of a person sitting on the bed. I didn't tell them the whole truth. Couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had disturbed, it wasn't finished with me. And it wouldn't stop until I was gone. I left town the next morning. I didn't pack much. Just some clothes, my laptop, and enough cash to get me far away. I didn't even tell Paul. I figured it was better if no one knew where I was. For the next few months, I bounced from place to place. Cheap motels, out-of-the-way towns, always paying in cash, always looking over my shoulder. I stayed off social media, used a burner phone, and avoided making connections with anyone. But no matter how far I ran, the tapping always found me. It didn't happen every night. Sometimes weeks would go by without a sound, and I'd start to believe I was safe. But then, just when I let my guard down, tap tap. The worst part was how deliberate it felt, like it was playing a game with me. Could have ended me any time it wanted, but it didn't. It wanted me to know it was there, watching, waiting. Eventually, I stopped running. It wasn't helping, and I was tired. Physically, emotionally, mentally. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let me go. So I decided to face it. I returned to the college campus. The East Tower had been shut down since my last visit. Officially, it was due to structural issues, but I knew the truth. Too many students had reported strange occurrences, and the administration had quietly closed the building, hoping the rumors would die out. The place was a ghost town when I arrived. Most of the dorms were dark, and the East Tower loomed in the distance, its windows like empty eyes. I broke in through the same emergency exit as before. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mold and dust. My footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell as I made my way to the top floor. The door to the roof was still open. I stepped out into the cold night air, the city lights stretching out below me. And there they were, the figures. They stood in a line near the edge of the roof, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their bodies twisted and unnatural, their movements jerky and inhuman. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" For a moment there was silence. Then the tallest figure stepped forward, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. "You broke the rules," it rasped. "What rules?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "You were warned," it said. "You were told to leave. You didn't." I clenched my fists, anger flaring through my fear. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to see you, to know about any of this." The figure tilted its head further, the movement slow and deliberate. "It is not about want. It is about choice. You chose to return." The others began to move, surrounding me in a loose circle. Their voices rose, a horrible chorus that made my skin crawl. "Leave, leave, leave. I can't," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "You follow me no matter where I go. What do you want me to do?" The tallest figure stopped inches from me, its face so close I could feel the icy chill radiating from its hollow eyes. "Run," it whispered, and then it stepped back, joining the others at the edge of the roof. Without another word, they tipped backward, falling into the darkness below. I stood there, shaking, staring at the empty space where they had been. I don't know how long I stayed on that roof. Long enough for the cold to seep into my bones. Long enough for the realization to sink in. I could run for the rest of my life, but it wouldn't matter. They'd always find me, and maybe that was the point. To keep running, to keep looking over my shoulder, to never stop being afraid. I left the city that night, not because I thought it would help, but because I didn't have any other choice. Now I stay on the move. I don't settle anywhere for long. I don't make friends. I don't let my guard down. And every so often, I hear it again. Tap tap. A reminder that they're still watching, that I can't escape, and that one day they'll stop waiting. It's been 2 years since that night on the roof. 2 years of running, of keeping my head down and trying to stay invisible. I don't think I've truly slept since then. Not without waking up in a cold sweat, the sound of tapping echoing in my mind. But now I've stopped running, because I know I can't outrun them. The decision wasn't easy, but something inside me shifted the day I found the symbol. It happened in a rundown motel somewhere in Nebraska. The place smelled like mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling in long, jagged strips. I was cleaning out my duffel bag when I found it. A small piece of paper tucked into one of the side pockets. I hadn't put it there. The paper was blank except for a single, hand-drawn symbol in the center. It looked like a circle with jagged lines cutting through it, almost like cracks in glass. I stared at it for hours, turning it over and over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. And then, as I lay in bed that night, I heard the tapping again. Tap tap. But this time it wasn't outside the window or on the walls. It was coming from inside the room. I sat up, heart pounding, clutching the paper in one hand and my phone in the other. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it stopped abruptly. And then I saw it. The symbol, etched into the motel mirror, glowing faintly in the dark. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I stood and approached the mirror, holding the paper up to the glowing mark. As soon as the two touched, the room plunged into darkness. And I wasn't alone. They were there, surrounding me, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the void. "You are ready?" the tallest one rasped, its voice reverberating through the air like a distant thunderstorm. "For what?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "To end the game," it said. Suddenly, the darkness shifted, and I was no longer in the motel. I was standing on the roof of the East Tower, the city lights stretching out below me like a sea of fireflies. The figures stood in a circle around me, their movements slow and deliberate. The tallest one stepped forward, holding out a long, thin object wrapped in black cloth. I hesitated, but something told me to take it. My fingers trembled as I pulled the cloth away, revealing a jagged shard of obsidian, its surface smooth and cold. "This is your choice," the figure said, "to fight or to fade." I didn't understand at first, but then the others began to move, their voices rising in a deafening chorus. "Fight, fight, fight." I gripped the shard tightly, my knuckles white. "What am I fighting?" I demanded. The tallest figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes boring into mine. "Us," it said. Before I could react, they rushed toward me. I don't remember much of what happened next, just flashes of movement, the cold bite of the wind, and the sound of my own screams. The shard in my hand seemed to move on its own, slicing through the darkness as the figures closed in. One by one, they fell, their bodies disintegrating into ash that swirled around me like a storm. When it was over, I stood alone on the roof, the shard still clutched in my hand. The city below was silent, the wind carrying away the last remnants of the ash. I don't know if I won, but I haven't heard the tapping since. I still carry the shard with me, wrapped in the same black cloth. It's a reminder of what I faced, and what might still be out there. Because even though the tapping is gone, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't the end. That one day the game will start again. And when it does, I'll be ready. It's been 6 months since that night on the roof. 6 months of silence. At first, I thought I'd finally beaten them, that whatever I'd done with the shard had ended it. For the first time in years, I started to feel something like normal. I stopped running, found a small apartment in a city where no one knew me, and even got a job. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. And I was right. It started with a dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I was standing on the roof of the East Tower again, the shard heavy in my hand. The city below was gone, replaced by a vast, endless void. The figures were there too, but they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their hollow eyes locked on me. Then, one by one, they began to dissolve, their forms crumbling into ash that drifted into the void. But as the last figure faded, something else appeared. A shape in the darkness. It was massive, far larger than the figures had been. Its outline was jagged and shifting, like a storm cloud trapped in a glass jar. And in the center of the shape, a single eye opened. An eye that seemed to pierce straight through me, filling my chest with a cold, suffocating dread. I woke up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat. The shard was on the nightstand next to me, its surface darker than usual, almost pulsing. That was the first sign. The second came a few days later. I was walking home from work when I noticed the shadows. At first, they seemed normal, just the usual shapes cast by streetlights and passing cars. But as I turned the corner, I realized they weren't behaving like shadows should. They moved against the light, twisting and curling toward me like they were alive. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. And then I heard it, not tapping this time, whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, threading through the air like a soft breeze. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, guttural, and full of malice. I ran the rest of the way home, locking the door behind me and pulling every curtain shut. The shard sat on the coffee table, its surface glinting in the dim light. I picked it up, hoping for some kind of answer, but all I felt was a cold, empty weight. The whispering didn't stop after that. It followed me everywhere, on the bus, in the grocery store, even at work. Always faint, just on the edge of hearing, like a secret being told to someone else. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the shard and demanded answers, shouting into the empty room like a lunatic. "What do you want from me?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, the shard grew warm in my hand, and the whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single, clear voice. "You opened the door." "What door?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The shard pulsed, and the voice replied, "The one you cannot close." Before I could respond, the shard's surface cracked, a thin, glowing line splitting it down the middle. And then the lights went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and I felt the air grow heavy, pressing down on my chest. In the corner of the room, a shape began to form, a mass of shadows, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The eye from my dream opened in the center, its gaze locking onto me. "You were warned," the voice said, echoing from all around me. The shape began to move toward me, slow and deliberate, its presence filling the room with an unbearable pressure. I clutched the shard, its jagged edges biting into my palm, and did the only thing I could think of. I ran, out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the city, my lungs burning and my mind racing. I don't know what that thing was, but I know one thing for sure. The figures on the roof weren't the real enemy. They were just the beginning. And whatever I've unleashed, it's not done with me yet. I've come to accept one truth. This ends with me. For weeks, I've been on the run again, but it's different now. The shadows don't just follow, they shape the world around me. Streetlights flicker and die when I pass. Reflections warp in store windows, showing something behind me that isn't there when I turn around. I see that eye in every mirror, watching, waiting. The shard, once a weapon, is now a curse. The crack down its center grows wider each day, glowing faintly like an open wound. I know it's a beacon, calling the thing closer, tethering it to me. I can't run forever, so I've made my choice. It started with research, late nights in libraries, scrolling through obscure forums and archives, following every lead no matter how desperate. I found fragments of stories, warnings from others like me. None ended well, but they all pointed to the same place. The East Tower. It began there, and it has to end there. Tonight, I'm going back. The campus is colder than I remember, the buildings looming like dark sentinels against the night sky. The East Tower is a hollow shell, abandoned and forgotten, but the air around it feels alive, heavy with a presence that presses against my skin. I climb the stairs one last time, the shard burning in my hand like a live coal. With each step, the whispers grow louder, converging into a cacophony that makes my ears ring. When I reach the roof, the city below feels impossibly far away, like I've stepped into another world. The figures are waiting for me. They stand in a circle, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. But this time, they aren't the enemy. They bow their heads in unison, stepping aside to reveal what waits in the center of the roof. It's here, the thing from my dream, a swirling mass of shadows and jagged light, its single eye pulsing with a malevolent glow. The ground trembles beneath me as it shifts and grows, its edges stretching out like tendrils, curling toward me. "You cannot win," the voice says, echoing from the depths of the thing. I tighten my grip on the shard, the edges slicing into my palm. Blood drips onto the concrete, and the glow from the shard intensifies, the crack widening further. "You cannot run," the voice continues, each word a hammer blow against my resolve. I step forward, my heart pounding. "I'm not running anymore." The thing surges toward me, its tendrils lashing out, but the shard reacts. A blinding light erupts from the crack, forcing the tendrils back. The figures around me begin to chant, their voices a low, guttural hum that rises and falls in rhythm with the pulsing light. I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I can't stop now. I plunge the shard into the center of the thing. The world explodes. When I wake, the roof is quiet. The figures are gone, their hollow eyes no longer watching. The shard lies shattered at my feet, its pieces dull and lifeless. The air feels lighter, like the weight of the thing has been lifted. But I know it's not over. Not really. I can feel the scars it left behind. Not on my body, but on the world. The shadows are quieter now, but they're still there, waiting, watching. I leave the East Tower as the sun rises, the first light of dawn breaking over the empty campus. For now, the game is over, but I know better than to believe it's truly ended. Because when I close my eyes, I still hear it. Tap tap. A reminder that the darkness is never far behind. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.